I almost slept in this morning, and then when I got in, with about a minute or two to spare, the room didn't work. I was not able to turn on the projection system. So this should be an interesting morning. Anyhow, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, and that is viewing layouts for our prototype here. And just to sort of refresh your memory, we've taken the same. Oh. By the way, this is a good chance to show you something. I've had a number of students say after they zip up their file, they're not able to see their pictures or their CSS isn't linked properly. That is true. You cannot view your web page. It will let you click on it, but you can't view your web page if it's in the zip file. So if I click that, the CSS is not applied. What I have to do first is I have to extract it. Then after I extract it, then I can view my web page and it will work. All right. So we viewed several different things so far, and each one of those has their purpose. And also each one of those you might encounter if you ever get a job that already has a website, right? Because we're going to talk about some techniques that are maybe a little bit preferred compared to other techniques. But keep in mind that maybe the person that did the website before you didn't learn those techniques, or for whatever reason chose a different way to do it. So we're covering all these different ways of styling your page, just in case you encounter a current site, if you were working for someone and you see their current site uses one of these. So I think it's good to be familiar with a variety of different ways to do it. A, that allows you to pick which way is the best for the situation that you run into. B, it might be out of your control because they may have already started doing something a certain way and you don't want to necessarily redo the whole thing from scratch. All right. Anyhow, the first prototype was where I did not position any of these elements. I just went with the flow. All right. So what does that mean? That means that these things are stacked on top of each other. All right. The only difference with this is the difference between this and the old web pages that you did with no style is I sort of styled each little block that stacks on top of each other. I gave them a margin to center them. I gave them a curved little border around it, and I styled it in other ways a little bit more. And again, this is the same way that it did before in the sense that I've not done anything with the position. I've just let them stack. Now, this is an important concept to cover as well, because if we look at the second prototype, well, no, the second prototype is about the same, except it's based on a percentage instead of an absolute number of pixels. And then it stops at a different point. But when we compare that to the third version of the prototype, I give positions for each of the elements. And I gave them by specifying how far from the top, how far over to the left. And again, this is nice and it looks okay on this screen, but again, as the screen gets wider or smaller, it doesn't adjust to it. Likewise, it would not adjust if you viewed this on a phone. So there's some drawbacks to this. The advantage is you can get pretty much precisely the view that you wanted to. The other problem with this is if it was bigger, this would look maybe like a postage stamp up in the one corner of the screen. It might only take up that amount of space if there was a bigger screen. Because this really does not have a very high resolution. But it's still, the page still looks good. All right. One thing I would say is notice that I've used the positioning only on the major elements of the page. And that's a mistake that many newer people to CSS make, is they try to micromanage and put a position on every single element on the page. Remember, your web browser is smart. All right, it knows how to position things inside a container. So if I give a position to the header, the nav, the content area, and the footer, I don't have to worry about giving a position to each of these individual paragraphs. They just flow. If there's no position given, they just flow inside their container. And when I say inside the container, I mean inside the element that they were nested in. So don't try to micromanage your CSS. Don't try to give a position to everything on the page. Style the main things on the page and let the other elements go with the flow. And if you need to change that a little bit, okay. But that should be your sort of your first shot, not to worry about like trying to style every little thing. Now this one again, we had a top and a left for each of the elements. This one, we used relative positioning where we told it where things are going to go related to the position where they were supposed to go. In other words, this thing was supposed to be down here, but we moved it to the left, from the left and up a certain number of pixels, so it fell into place right here. The other thing is we put a scroll bar on the content so that we could scroll. Let me see, that might be the last one that we covered. Oh, no, this one was fixed. We did cover this one. And this is where we take one element, and specifically it's usually going to be the navigation, and make it fixed so that as we scroll the page, the navigation stays in place. That is a nice technique to ensure that the navigation is always visible to the user and they can always get wherever they want to. All right. Sometimes, and again, I remember trying this but having some problems. Sometimes the header is fixed, and as you can scroll, the header stays fixed. That's especially useful if the header contains the navigation. Last but certainly not least, we started to cover, no, we didn't. We didn't start it off. This last technique, which is known as floating. Now, that's what we're going to pick up today. Are there any questions about the techniques that we've studied so far? Fixed, the fixed, the absolute, the relative, the flow. Okay, we're going to start off with this one, but first, we're going to look at an example that is not our prototype. And that is this float example. I open up this web page, and I might have to change some things around here because of this very small screen. But let's look at what I'm doing here. I have a page with two sections inside of it. I never realized pork belly was a word in Latin or Greek. But I have two sections with some Greek text in it. No style on it. So without style, it'll put them next to each other like this, stacked on top of each other. What if I want them from side to side? Actually, this looks like fake Greek text, by the way, because there's some words in here. Jean shorts, Helvetica, meh, brunch. All right, anyhow. let's say I want them stacked side by side instead of on top of each other. Remember, on top of each other is the flow. That's what you're going to get if you do not otherwise style them. Let's look at how I did style them, and we'll play around with that a bit. Let me put the style back in it, by the way. All right. I'm going to fix this because right now it is, I must have saved it after making some tweaks to it. I'm going to make the width 30%, and I'm going to make it float left. So this is if I want them stacked next to each other. All right. The rest of it you've seen, the border, the padding, the margin, but float left. What does that mean? That means to push it as far over to the left as you can. So let's view this page. Can you see that, by the way? If someone wants to go and play with the light so you can see with it better, you're welcome to. If I view it in the browser, they're stacked next to each other. Here's what it does. It takes the first section and shoves it as far to the left as it possibly can, given the margin and all the other things. So that puts it along the left side of the screen. It will then try to put the next thing as shoved as far to the left as possible. Well, in this case, because I made the size of them 30%, that's 30% for the first section, a few extra bytes or a few extra pixels in here, then 30% left or for the second section. It can fit the second section alongside the first section. So it does. All right. If these numbers were too big, if, for example, I made it 55%, it can't fit those two side by side, right? Because you can't have 110%. 110% is too wide. There's not enough space for the second thing. And what it will do then is it will drop that below. All right. These were sometimes called liquid layouts because, like a liquid, the page flows depending on the size of the container. The page conforms itself to the size of the container. And what I can do even is I can give an absolute number in here if I want to. And we can even watch and see. I'm going to make it 300 pixels, the width. All right, with each of these 300 pixels, it can fit them side by side. This is shoved all the way to the left, and there's space. The remaining space must be bigger than 300 pixels because it can fit it alongside of it. As the page gets smaller and smaller, boom. We can even tell at this point, right here, we've gone to having enough space to not having enough space. And at that point, it drops it down. When do you think this might be useful to do this? Pardon me? With mobile devices, exactly. On a computer screen, it's not good to have very long lines of text. right? It becomes difficult to read if the lines of text are very long because your eye tends to go up or down a little bit, depending on, as you read across a long line. So therefore, 2 columns is good for big screens, all right? That's what they do with newspapers, right? If you ever notice, newspapers are in columns. Why? Because it's very difficult to read if you had a sentence that went all the way across a newspaper. Your eye would tend to move a little bit, and you'd read the second part of a sentence and the first part of another sentence. So therefore, they put them in columns, and it's good for columns on a wide screen. However, generally speaking, you want a single column display on a mobile device. And this accomplishes that. And not just mobile device, in smaller browser windows. Let's say I'm working on something and I have this browser window small because I have a Word window open over here. Again, it will put it so that it's one on top of each other if there's not enough space. All right. And this is a nice feature of the browser to do that. As a general rule, up and down scrolling is better than side-to-side scrolling. Because side-to-side scrolling, you read the first part of the sentence, then you have to scroll and read the second half of the sentence. With this, I can read the whole sentences, and I don't have to scroll till I come down here. With horizontal scrolling, if I was reading a long sentence across, I would have to scroll horizontally every sentence I read. All right. It's just a feature of how our language works, how things go from left to right and then go down. All right. That makes it better to vertically scroll than horizontal scroll. Any questions about this? I did this just to demonstrate the idea of floating, and we can play around a little bit with this. Remember that the margin also counts. So the size of this box is not 300 pixels. The size of this box is 300 pixels plus the 20 pixels to the right and left. That would make it 340 pixels plus 10 pixels padding on both sides. That would make it 360 pixels plus a right border and a left border of 1 pixel. That would make it, and I lost count, but I think it would be 362 pixels going across. That's why it doesn't turn exactly when the screen is 600 pixels. It would turn when the screen is 600 and some pixels, because you have to add on these things. In other words, if I made both of these 50% and 50%, whoops. If I made the width of them 50%, you might think they could sit side by side because one takes up half of the page, the other takes up a half the page. But if we look, it doesn't. Because it doesn't take up 50% exactly. It takes 50% of the width of the screen, plus it would be 32 times 2 because it's right and left. So it would be 50% plus 64 pixels. So if I really wanted to be 50% of the page or half the page, I might make this number 46%. I wanted to type 45, but we'll try 46%. Oh, still not good enough. Let's take it down to 40%. All right, there they do fit. But as soon as you move that a little bit, boom, goes down. Now, this is where minimum widths get to be effective. All right, minimum and maximum widths, but usually minimum widths. Because I might want to say, I want this to be 40%, but I don't want it to get any smaller than 300 pixels. So I could say the minimum I want to make this is 300 pixels. That way, no matter what, it's not going to make it smaller than 300 pixels, no matter how wide the screen is. Did I forget to save that? Min width, 300 pixels. Let's make it 400. Okay, as I make it smaller, it will not get any, as I make the window scroller, it will not get any smaller than 400 pixels. No matter what I do, even though there's a percentage associated with it. Now, if we review this in a mobile browser, let's change it to 300 pixels again. Or change it to, yeah, 300 pixels. No. Let's make it 500, 600 pixels. All right. That's the start of a better mobile design. This isn't the only thing that we need to do, but it's moving in the direction of having a good mobile design. Now let's look at our actual page now that we've gone over this short example. Oh no, let's play with this some more. I changed my mind. Let's make the minimum width back to 300 pixels, 40%. I can float in all four directions: left, top, right, and bottom. I usually typically only use the left, but you can use left and right. So, for example, I could go in here and give this an ID. And go in here and give this an ID. If I wanted to apply a different style to each of them. Then I would change my selector to be # section 1. The # means to select using an ID. Don't select using the HTML tag. I'll make the minimum width of this 200 pixels. And I'm going to float it to the right. Now that's the dot section is for a class. I made that an ID. Oh, I didn't save it. Yeah, if I made the class equals, I'd use a dot, not the ID equals. Okay. How are we going to debug this? Well, we're going to look at the code. It seems like the width is not taking. So I'm going to look at the width attribute. That looks right. Yeah, let's try that. There's another thing we can do. We can run this through the CSS validator. I'm going to copy my code and go to validators. Oh, you know what it is? I forgot to, I probably forgot to put the style back in, but we'll check it anyhow. We'll go to the actual official W3C webpage, which is the organization that sets standards for web pages. And I can paste my code in, and it will tell me if there's any errors. Congratulations, no errors found. You can think of this as kind of like a spell check, right? Just like spell check finds words that are misspelled. If I misspelled something in the CSS code, it would find that. Let's look back at this. Yeah, I undid it, but I didn't save all. There we go. If this doesn't work, I'm going to take it up to, or I'm just going to think that this day is cursed and go home and go to bed. There we go. Notice how there's a gap in between them, because this one floats all the way to the left, this one floats all the way to the right. As I make it narrower, they sort of converge in the middle. This one keeps getting smaller after this one stops because I gave them a different minimum width. And as we make it down here, it floats, except this one is floated to the left and this one is floated to the right. What do you suppose will happen if I float both of them to the right? Let's float both of these to the right. It'll do that, but it's actually going to switch the order of them because it takes the first element, shoves it as far to the right as it can. It takes the second one, tries to put it alongside of it, but doesn't fit, then it'll put it underneath it. So there's the first that got pushed all the way to the right. The second one can fit, and therefore it gets put alongside of it to the left side of it. And if I make it smaller at a certain point, that goes down and it appears alongside that way. You can also float top and bottom. I never use those. Those confuse me. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. Let's see if there's an example online. Oh, CSS only supports left and right. I was wrong about that. You can't float to the top and bottom. Good. No wonder I could never get it to work. Now, There's something that you can do. The footer is 100%, which means that it will only appear by itself on the page. So notice our footer, which is down here, is always on its own line. Well, what if I do this? Let's try to explain what's going on here. If I make these, make them 30%, let's get rid of the minimum width. Make this 30%. And let's make the width of this 20%. It puts the footer alongside of it. All right. Why does it do that? Well, remember this, that if you don't specify a position on an element, whether it be absolute, relative, or floating, it just puts the page, the element in the flow. So I gave a position to these two elements, so it positions them the way it does. This one I did not give anything to, therefore it puts it in the flow. Since this is the first element in the flow, it appears on the top of the page. You have to be very careful, or it would be possible to get two things that overlapped with each other. Like, let's go and do this. Oh, actually, let's get rid of the float left. That's what I had intended to do. And let's put a border of this. This is what I wanted to do the first time. Those two things overlap. And depending on the particular issue, that can be or not be a problem. Why is that a problem? That's 100%, but it doesn't have a float on it. All right. Therefore, it puts it in the flow. Since this is the first element in the flow, it puts it on the top of the page and makes it 100%. It worked before because I said float left or float right on that element. I can put this style rule in, though, to make the floating stop and sort of start with a new baseline, start with a new starting position for the flow. And what that is to say clear both. And boom, it considers then the starting position for the flow to be down here. All right, let's look at our prototype example using the float. All righty, let's close these. And go to prototype 6. It floats until it gets too small, then it pops it down below. Which I said, this isn't completely the way you would do a mobile page, but it's a start. It's moving in that direction. There's a few other things that you would need to do. And we'll talk about those probably the week we come back from break. By the way, in case you did not realize it, next week is spring break. So live it up, all right? I'll probably live it up by going to coffee shops and grade. All right, that's my idea of a fun spring break. The HTML we'll look at only to show you that it still hasn't changed. It's the same HTML that we had our very first example. Let's look at the CSS. All right, notice what I have. I put some style elements on that. What I'm mainly interested in is the position of the header, nav, section, and footer. The header made the width 95% and float left. What does that mean? That means that more than likely this header is going to be on a page all by itself, or on a line all by itself, because there's only 5% left, less than 5% left when I count the margin and padding and all that. Less than 5% left to put anything else, and nothing is going to be that narrow. So making it 95% is going to guarantee that that's on its own line. The nav, I've given a margin and a margin right, so it's going to be 20 pixels away from the header, and the width is 25% of the page. But the minimum width is 200 pixels, and I float that left. So 20 pixels away from there, 20 pixels away from there, 20 pixels away from there, and it'll be 25%, but it won't get any narrower than this. That will keep these things from getting too big and getting outside of their container. The section, 20%, float it to the left. Margin of 20 pixels. Remember, it collapses a margin. So if the one has the 20 pixels and the other has a 20 pixels, it does not make it 40 pixels. So the top has 20 pixels, or the header has 20 pixels. This has 20 pixels to the top. Therefore, it does not make 40 pixels. 20 satisfies both conditions. And is there a minimum width? No, there is not. But since there's a minimum width of the navigation, at a certain point, the screen is narrower. So where there's not enough room, including the margins, to fit that, it'll drop below. And finally, the footer is the same, with a width of 95% and so on. The width has the same style rule as the header. There is a nice shorthand you can do. If two things have the same style, like in this case, I want the footer to have the same style as the header. I can do this. Make the footer and header and the footer the same. But I didn't want them the same, right? I don't want the background image on the footer. So I'll go back to what I had originally. I forget why I put all these smiley faces on. I think to show that it's going to start the footer right underneath the content. With the other ones where we gave an absolute size, we had to give an absolute size for the footer, which means if we expanded the content, it would, we'd have to drop that down as well. I don't know, maybe I wanted everyone to be happy, so I drew a bunch of smiles. I don't remember why those are in there. Now notice this. This, when it came out, believe it or not, was like, this is so cool. All right, when we first figured out how to do this, because back in the old days, people wanted to make their links look like buttons. All right, and therefore they gave three-dimensional images, or what appeared to be three-dimensional images, and they made those images the background of their links. And then they put on the mouse over to change the image so it looked like it was depressed. Well, now that we've gone to flat buttons, we can make it look like buttons by going like this. You can actually make it a little more looking like buttons, if we wanted to, by maybe increasing the border radius a little bit. So it will look a little more like a rounded button, if we wanted to. I don't know, you can decide which one you like better. But notice when you put your mouse over it, it actually reverses that. And when you take your mouse out, it goes back to normal. Now, that's very easily accomplished by giving the link a display type of inline block. That means that this is sort of a hybrid. It acts like an inline and it acts like a block. This is sort of the magic words. When you do this, it pretty much works the way that you want it to. You can treat it like a block tag, all right? But it is stacked side by side. The reason that these are not stacked side by side is because they're 150 and the container is only 200 pixel minimum. Therefore, they get stacked on top of each other. And all I do is on the A, I give it a border, give it some colors. Then I've changed the style rule for hover to say, give it the background of this and the color of that, which is the exact opposite of the link in its normal state. Questions about this? All right, I'm going to give you a sneak preview of after spring break. This is going to be a cliffhanger, right? When TV shows like are going off for a while, they always use a cliffhanger to make you want to watch when you come back. We're going to study two more techniques for styling, and we're going to study a way to make mobile pages look different, drastically different than our desktop pages. The first one that we're going to review is notice that? Looks like a button, just like our links did. First thing we're going to review is something called, and you can sort of start looking at this in advance, but the first item we're going to review is called the grid layout. This is a cliffhanger for me too, because it's not showing it, the link. I don't know, weird things are afoot today. Well, you can click on those links if you want to know more, but we will go over this. Oh, there we go. Open Flexbox in a new window. The other one is Flexbox. And Flexbox allows you to make a grid and specify how many things are on each portion of the grid. It's even more flexible than the grid. The grid allows you to create and divide your page into grids, that is, rows and columns. Flexbox allows you to do that and even a few more things. So we'll cover those things next week. Actually, not next week. The next week we have classes, which is the week after next. Grid view generates a block level grid. A grid is sort of a big tool for graphic designers. When they lay something out, very often they think in terms of a grid. And this finally allowed people to do CSS to use grids for their web pages too, instead of some combination of floating and all the other things. All right, are there any questions? I'm happy to get out of this one alive. Have a great spring break, and the rest of the time is for your lab. All right.